Welcome back, quilting friends. Today I'm excited to share with you a Chex Mix Quilts trunk show. Chex Mix Quilts came out a couple years ago, but I have not yet shared a trunk show on the channel here, and I thought today is just the day to do that. So I'm going to be showing you the quilts from this book. We'll talk about the quilting, I'll show them up close, and we're gonna have a good time, so stick around. Chex Mix Quilts features 8 different quilt patterns. When I was designing the quilts for this book, I focused in on different seasons. So you're going to find quilts that work well for spring, summer, fall, and winter, and each of the quilts features some sort of a gingham look to it. I used simple strip piecing techniques, so even though some of these pieces are smaller, with the strip piecing, it does help them come together pretty quickly. The first quilt behind me is called Check Your Heart, and it uses just 2 different prints plus a background fabric. I do want to mention that a lot of these fabrics, because the book came out a couple years ago, are going to be harder to find. So I will have a blog post that goes along with this video. I'll link to it in the description box, where I will be sharing what fabric lines I would be using if I were remaking all of these quilts in current fabric lines. I think that's so helpful to give you guys some different options, help you to see them in different fabric lines so that you have some different ways you can approach your fabric shopping. All of the quilts in Chex Mix Quilts were quilted by Kayleen Perry. This one is called Ginger Heart, and it features a heart motif with little loops scattered around. You will also find the name of all of the quilting designs listed in the book. I included that information with all of the quilts. For those of you who might wish to use the quilting design but maybe aren't interested in purchasing the book, I will also have the quilting designs listed in the description box below, so that you have that information easily available to you. The next quilt in the book is called Rain Check, and it is actually the cover quilt for Chex Mix Quilts. I used a variety of yellow fabrics for the petals of the flowers, and it was just fun choosing different yellows from a variety of my collections. This quilting design I thought was so perfect for this quilt. The name of it is 60s Mod, and it's just sort of a little stem and petal design, and I really liked the vertical movement that it had. I just thought it perfectly complemented the quilt design so nicely. This quilt is called Tossed Checkerboard, and again, this is a scrappy mix of my fabric lines. The key for choosing the 2 prints within each block is to use the same color. You'll see this is a pink and a lighter pink. In your darker shade, you will use your color as the background. In your lighter shade, you want to use a background, and then the motif should feature the same fabric. So you'll see a white background with pink accents. In the purples, you'll see a purple background on the dark fabric, and then for the lighter version, it is a white background with that same purple tone for the motifs on the white background. And that is what creates that really pretty checkerboard pattern. You can see what I'm talking about with the gray fabrics right here. Here we have the gray with gray background with white flowers, and then the lighter is a white background with the same shade of gray for the motif. Same for the yellows up here. You'll see the darker fabric has the yellow background. The lighter fabric features the same yellow shade in the flower motif, and that just creates such a nice amount of contrast between those colors. The quilting on this quilt is modern loops, and you can see it's just a fun looped quilting design. This quilt is Checkered Flag. You might notice that the names of the quilts all also feature a checkered sort of name. So you saw Check Your Heart and Toss Checkerboards, and now we have Checkered Flag. And this would be the patriotic or 4th of July themed quilt for this book. And I think it turned out so pretty. For this quilting design, I wanted something that created the movement of a flag waving in the wind. And I think this worked just beautifully for that. This is called Modern Serpentine, and it's just a series of really tight at some spots, wavy lines. It's narrow in some sections and then it sort of widens up in other sections. And it just creates such a nice amount of movement across the whole quilt. This quilt is called Checkpoint, and the fabrics in this quilt are some beautiful wovens. I know some of you are a little bit intimidated with working with wovens, so I am going to link to a blog post that I shared when my Sugar Creek wovens hit quilt shops, and it talks about using wovens, it talks about pre-washing, mixing wovens and quilting cottons, and it might be helpful for some of you if you've had questions about working with wovens previously. I'll make sure and link to that in the description box so that you can check out that article if that's something you've been wondering about. The quilting design used on Checkpoint is called Diagonal Plaid, and this is another one of those quilting designs that I've used quite a bit. I feel like it really complements a lot of different quilt patterns. It is sort of a soft, boxed, echoing square shape, and I think it works really beautifully on this quilt. If you've hung out here for any length of time, you know that I love a maple leaf quilt. This is Maple Leaf Check, and it is my take on a maple leaf quilt pattern with a checked design. I used that same technique that I mentioned earlier for choosing the two fabrics within each of these maple leaf blocks, paying attention to the background fabric and then paying attention to the motif color for the white background fabrics within each quilt block. And it's just such an easy way to choose the two fabrics within each block. This quilting design is called Frozen Swirls, and it was really the perfect choice for this quilt. I wanted the leaves to feel like they were blowing in the wind, and that is exactly what this quilting design does. I couldn't be happier with the way this one turned out. This quilt is called Checking It Twice. It is a fat quarter friendly quilt full of a whole bunch of different motif fabric lines, and I think it's so festive for the holidays. The name of this quilting design is called Razzle Dazzle Down, which is a cute name for a cute quilting design. I thought it was fun that these little asterisk shapes throughout the quilting looked like little snowflakes, and I thought it was such a nice compliment to the quilt. And the last quilt in the book is called Coat Check, and it is this checked snowman quilt. It has checks not only spread across the quilt, but then in the border it has sort of a on-point checked design as well. Now, this does feature some raw edge applique for the eyes, nose, and buttons of the snowmen. That sort of applique is a simpler way to applique. It does mean that you will have raw edges in your quilt, which will fray a little bit as the quilt is washed. If you prefer not to applique, you could also opt to substitute those shapes with buttons. I would recommend doing that after the quilt is quilted, and when you are attaching the buttons, I would suggest just going down through the top layer of the quilt with your stitching, your hand stitching to secure those buttons, rather than going all the way down through into the backing of your quilt. That means that you wouldn't see any stitches after you have sewed those buttons on, and that would be a nice way to opt out of the applique if you preferred not to applique. This quilt has been washed and used, and you can see it has some fun crinkle going on. It also lets you see how the edges of that applique holds up after a washing. It will continue to fray a little bit the more it's washed. I like using Heat and Bond Light when doing applique. It's a really nice fusible web to work with. And the quilting design on this quilt is called First Snow, and it's swirls and snowflakes scattered throughout the quilt. I think it was another just perfect complement to this quilt pattern. I like when the quilting designs just perfectly complement the quilt. It doesn't always happen that I choose just the right thing. Sometimes I think, I could have chosen something a little bit better. But sometimes my choices work really well, and that just makes me so happy when they work so nicely with the quilt design. This is the last quilt in the book. I hope you have enjoyed this trunk show peek into the quilts in Chex Mix Quilts. This book is still available to purchase at quilt shops, both online and locally. I do have signed copies available in my Etsy shop. I don't have a lot still remaining, but there are some there right now available to purchase. If you have any questions about any of the quilts or anything I talked about in this video, feel free to comment to ask. I will make sure to link to everything I said I was going to in the description box, so you can check that out as well. And don't forget to check out my blog post with information about current fabric lines for these quilts. It was great chatting with you today, and I will hope to see you next time.